Welcome, everybody. This is Martin Grenzebach from Grenzebach Glier, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our fourth webinar entitled Fundraising in a Public Health Crisis. It's part of our Thought Leadership series. We're delighted today to have with us Dr. Mark Becker, who's the president of Georgia State University. But he has multiple qualifications he's ideal for our conversation today. Prior to being at Georgia State, he was provost for the University of South Carolina, but prior to that, he was the dean of public health at the University of Minnesota. A few words about Mark and his background. He arrived at Georgia State in 2009, has had a remarkable tenure as president of that institution, and has overseen some extraordinary and dynamic growth. The university is now the largest university in the state of Georgia with an enrollment of over 50,000 students. But more remarkable than its growth in size is its extraordinary growth in I guess, quality and performance. It's become a national model for student success. It's set records for graduation rates, the number of students it graduates. It's been a leading university in the country and so noted for eliminating disparities in student achievement based on race, ethnicity, and income. But that's not all the story. At the same time, the university has dramatically increased its research footprint, more than doubling the national rate in its research productivity, and now has a research portfolio of over $100 million. Many of you probably have seen a lot of the national recognition and coverage Georgia State has received in notable publications and media outlets, including 60 Minutes, the Wall Street Journal, and multiple articles in the New York Times. I believe, and Mark will correct me if I'm wrong, but for at least a couple of years in a row, Georgia State is identified as the second most innovative university in the country. And I believe also this year, Georgia State was singled out as the best undergraduate education in the country. So it's really been an extraordinary period for the institution and its impact on its students and its impact on higher education. We're going to talk today about three topics broadly. One is how the university has pivoted during the pandemic and what kind of challenges they've encountered in so doing and what kind of lessons have been learned in that pivot. Secondly, Dr. Becker's perceptions on the impact of COVID-19, both short-term, intermediate-term, and long-term, on philanthropy and raising funds for GSU. And thirdly, more broadly and writ large, what is the impact, the long-term impact of COVID-19 on higher education, maybe more specifically public higher education, and public higher education in the state of Georgia. So before we get started, let me remind you, we have approximately 30 minutes. We'll go to 12:30 or so Central Time. You're welcome to submit questions, which we cannot entertain in real time, but we are committed to responding to all the questions we receive, either here at the firm or directed to Dr. Becker. So having said that, welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us. I hope we're not keeping you from getting a haircut down there in Atlanta this morning. And to my first topic, tell me how the pivot to distance learning has gone at GSU.
Well, thank you, Martin. It's always a pleasure to be with you, whether like this or in person. And I can only say that I'm assuming that my hairstyle is going to go back to what it was in the 1970s. It's just going to have to keep growing. But as far as the pivot goes, you know, it seems like a long time ago, but only 5 or 6 or maybe 7 weeks ago, it's hard to remember, you know, we announced that we would suspend classes for 2 weeks to make that pivot. And the first thing I want to say that I think it's really important for people to understand and appreciate is the pivot was to what we call remote learning or learning at a distance. I don't call it online learning. Because online education is delivery of content, courses, material, curriculum that was designed to be done that way. And they're certainly not in the situation where we are doing what we had designed at the beginning of the semester. So remote or learning at a distance. And first thing I'll say is the instruction itself has gone as smoothly as you could hope for. I was pleasantly surprised when we came out of that suspended period to return to instruction. I expected a lot of bumps, a lot of complaints, and we had anything but. I think I had one student complain me out of our more than 50,000, or one student write to me to complain out of our more than 50,000. So that part went smoothly. I think there's no question that every single faculty member understands the circumstances and understands that we had no choice but to go in this direction, and they responded accordingly. And likewise, the students. I think what's more interesting for the Georgia State story is not only did we pivot the instruction, but we had to pivot all those student services for which we've been noted and touted. As you mentioned, we've got a model for student success that has been of national and international interest. We've hosted delegations from around the world. And if you include all higher education delegations to visit Georgia State plus international, I think we've had over 500 delegations come for a structured program we have on what is our model for serving students. And what's very important at this time and was critical to that pivot is that our model is very data-based and leverages technology in very significant ways. So just to give two quick examples. Our student advising, we have a data warehouse where we have all of our relevant data for students and their educational progress in one place. The academic advisors for the students have access. Each one has their own set of students. They have access to the data. Every night we check 800 variables for every undergraduate student in that database and look to see if anything's changed. And then if there is, the student and the advisor would meet. So historically, the student and the advisor would meet face to face. Well, now the meeting happens like we're talking right now. It happens over the web. It could be over the phone, or it could be through a WebEx meeting. And so they could actually see each other and have that interaction. In addition, because of the changed circumstances, we were able to add new alerts into the database. So for example, with the pivot to learning at a distance, we know, because of the technology used, which students have logged into the platform that's supporting the instruction, and how long have they been engaged on the platform. So we now have alerts letting us know when students are not engaging. And in other words, they're not accessing their courses and they're not spending time there. So again, the advisors can notify the students by text or by phone or by email and arrange a conversation as to what's up and what is the issue. Is it an access issue? Is it a technology issue? Or is it just a lack of commitment issue? And so those issues, we were able to pivot not only academically, but there. Another important.
Let me ask a question, Mark. Just interrupt on that topic. I suppose you then track and do you have data on what kind of attrition you've experienced? What students just haven't participated? What percentage?
Yeah, so the most recent data I have is from a week ago, and over 95% of the students were engaged. And I would say that when we were face to face, that 95% engagement was very positive. So 95% online we're thrilled with. The other thing that we did do is we offered we extended the period in which a student could withdraw a course from a course without penalty. And this was a case where students could request a withdrawal. That request required a conversation with their advisor, and only about a quarter of the students that were considering withdrawing actually ended up withdrawing from a course or more. So we're basically being able to do what we're known for in terms of providing just-in-time advising to students based on their perceived need or us recognizing in the data that they have a need, and just do that remotely and at a distance.
Before we move on to category 2, and maybe it's not a fair question, it's obviously a premature question, but a couple of the presidents I know of have announced our students are going to be back in the fall. What's your thinking about the return to campus? Your campus is downtown Atlanta, and downtown Atlanta is your campus. So there's no way you're going to wall them off from the rest of the world by any means.
Exactly. And that's far and away where we're spending most of our time and energy right now, are answering those questions. So let me start with, we're online for the summer, and online meaning these courses will be designed to be done from beginning to end online. So a different quality in terms of the academic delivery for the summer. And in the summer, we generally have about 17,000 to 18,000 students. And as of right now, our enrollment projections for the summer are actually up. So it is interesting because that's one of the other questions that, that presidents are asking on the calls I'm on, and I'm sure you're hearing it, Martin, is will the students come back, or if it's online, will they stay with us? But at least for the summer, we are seeing that stickiness. We announced the decision to be online for the summer quite a while ago, and that's where it is. So that, the enrollment's up, the summer session starts in a few weeks. We'll see if they stay with us, but certainly at this point, they are registering for their courses, and we will deliver it that way. But as we turn to the fall, it's a very different situation, as you can imagine, because it's no secret that the leadership in the White House and in state houses all want to get back to some sense of normalcy. And I think we all do. People really don't want to be sheltering in place for a year. And so, I, like all presidents, or all the presidents I'm talking to, we're standing up a set of task forces, and breaking it down. At least the way I'm breaking it down is by what I'll call functional areas. So I've got one task force just looking at how do we restart our research activities. We did not shut down all research activities, and we certainly ramped up research activities related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've been operating at a limited capacity in research, but how do we basically create an environment where it is safe for people to come back into the labs, into their research facilities, whether that's computer access or with special technology, or whether it's at physical laboratories. So that's one task force. Another task force is the academic curriculum, looking at, we serve in the fall over 53,000 students, about 35,000 of those in downtown Atlanta, another 17,000 in our suburban satellite campuses. And what are we going to be able to do there from a curriculum point of view, given what we know about this virus right now, which is not a lot. What we do know about the virus is it's an extremely challenging virus. As one person said, it's the most exciting pathogen he's seen, but he's an infectious disease person, so he would call this exciting. But it is probably the most challenging pathogen in any of our lifetimes in terms of its ability to stay hidden and spread by being present in asymptomatic individuals who can be spreaders. So as we look at the fall, we're going through and looking at, what makes sense to do on campus and what we just won't be able to do on campus. So that turns to what I'll call the third workforce, which really has the hardest job, which is what can the students do on campus? How many students can we have on campus, and in what type of environments? And so start off with residence halls. We have over 5,000 beds. Are we going to be in a situation as we were in when we depopulated the residence halls, but had a few hundred that had to stay with us because they had nowhere to go? In that case, we put every student in a private room and they had a private bathroom. Are we going to have to be there in the fall? If we have to be there, we can't house 5,000 students. It's probably much less than that. Down around, I won't speculate, but a much lower number. Likewise, will we be able to open rec centers? Will we be able to open the library? Our library during the middle of the day when classes are in session literally has thousands of students in it, because for a lot of them, that's where they are when they're not in class. Can we open our student center? All those sorts of questions. And really, for me, it comes down to one very basic question that I've asked epidemiologists, and we do not yet have the answer, which is how many people can go in an elevator at one time? Right now, the answer is one. Okay, so the question becomes, if everybody is wearing a mask, how many people can go in an elevator? And can you assume it to be safe that you're not going to get the virus from somebody in that elevator if everyone's wearing a mask? We don't know that, but that fundamental question will the answer to that fundamental question will drive a lot of these other issues.
And a lot of your classrooms are in high-rise facilities.
Yeah, no, exactly. As you said, we're in a downtown environment. We're not in a lot of one-story or two-story buildings sparsely spread out.
Though we could talk about this for the whole session, I recognize, let me ask a few questions about philanthropy. And during this highly pressurized time for a CEO of an institution, what has your thoughts been, and how have you been able to spend any time on philanthropy? And if so, in what form? Philanthropy, advancement, communicating with prospects, particularly your larger donors.
Yeah, exactly. So, as we made this pivot, and it was certainly in consultation with you, we immediately pivoted philanthropy to a stewardship phase, realizing that that immediate time was not the time to go back to individuals and ask for money, but rather to connect with them, make sure that they are well, make sure that they are safe, hear their concerns, and then let them know how their university is doing. And by college, by department, by donor, it's what are their specific interests, what are their concerns. As we moved further into the pandemic, and even before there was a CARES Act, it was immediately obvious to us that we have a lot of economically fragile students, and we immediately started fundraising for a student emergency fund, an emergency aid fund. Our foundation board took leadership in that, and basically all the board members donated, and many donated, substantially. Let's say, in our case, the 5-figure case for many of the donors. And so we immediately had a few $100,000 out of the gate and when I say emergencies, the sort of example is, I got to choose between rent and food. And if I don't choose rent, I'm going to get kicked out. So I need food. And so, we work with grocery stores, and basically within 24 hours could have a card for that grocery store for a student so they could go get food. So we were able to stand that up, and then that ties into how we're going to use the CARES Act fund, direct funds from the federal government that are directed to students. It ties into our ability there. But we are moving now to the phase of, we see in May, towards the end of May, being able to restart some conversations with donors about their specific interests, where they were already well along in wanting to do something. Us being sensitive to understanding what their sources of their wealth and that funds their philanthropy are, knowing that some people have been damaged in the stock market, although I'd say at this point it's not nearly as bad as I ever would have predicted it's been. That still remains to play out. But so we are starting to think about the re-engage on a one-by-one case based on the donors' demonstrated and shared interest, as well as continued capacity. But again, those probably will not be face-to-face, with handshakes and all.
Mark, you have some wonderful large corporate and particularly foundation funders. Have there been conversations since the pandemic with them? Have they taken any kind of aggressive posture in helping the institution?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Martin, and you're absolutely right. We have a very strong corporate and foundations community here in Atlanta, and they've been very generous to Georgia State. And so the answer, it's a bifurcated answer. There was a very quick recognition that, that not only our students, but a lot of people in the Atlanta metropolitan region with over 6 million people, there's a lot of economically fragile individuals. And a number of foundations and corporations immediately said that they would give, quite sizable sums, 8-figure sums, into the community foundation, the Atlanta Community Foundation. Shepherds, as all community foundations do, a lot of resources. So for one set of our established relationships, as we reach out and talk with them, they basically said, look, we've put a lot of money in the community foundation. Go there for our philanthropy. And to the credit is we approached the community foundation very early, and they said, yes, absolutely. Georgia State students in particular are appropriate. And so we have received funding from the community foundation as funded by those. In the other cases, corporations and foundations with which we have long established relationships have, almost to every single one, if they have not contributed to the community foundation, they're more than willing to engage with us in conversations. And at this point, a significant percentage have already committed funds for our students through our emergency relief fund.
I know you, of course, just concluded last year your first comprehensive campaign ahead of schedule and over goal. Congratulations. And I know you were eager to get into the next campaign within the next year or so. Has your thinking changed? Has your timetable changed? Has the narrative changed?
So the narrative changed. My thinking and timetable have not changed. So let me start with particularly why the timetable hasn't changed. I came to Georgia State in January 2009. That was a few months after Lehman Brothers had gone under, and the stock market was terrible. Unemployment was at 15%. And in the first 12 months at Georgia State, the state of Georgia cut our budget by $52 million. We ended up with furloughs and layoffs. So the answer is, but in 2009, we immediately started thinking about getting ready for a capital campaign. So now's not the right time to go live with a campaign, I would suggest, but now it is the time to basically be putting in place the infrastructure to establish goals, establish priorities, so that we can very quickly, say down the road a year or two, be in the silent phase and be public, a few years after that. So we were on that timeline anyway, so I don't see this as changing anything. I expect that if this recession that we're going through is like all recessions, there will eventually be a recovery. And when there is a recovery, that'll be the right time for us to be very, very deeply in the campaign mode. So those parts are unchanged. What is changing, I think, is going to be the case. Georgia State is sort of a unique institution. You mentioned in the intro our research. If you look at research universities that do not have a medical school and do not have an engineering school, we're #1 in the country for research expenditures. And one driver of that is, even though we don't have a medical school, our Institute of Biomedical Sciences is very much a basic medical sciences research institute. It runs like the basic sciences in a medical school. And we happen to have, and the focus of that institute is immunology, inflammation, and infection. In addition to that, our biology and chemistry departments and arts and sciences are oriented that way. And so what the community is seeing writ large, not here in Georgia, but beyond, is that we were immediately able to pivot research in things like Ebola and Zika virus and other viruses to this pathogen, SARS-CoV-2. And so we've got faculty right now doing important work. One of the faculty members in biology, Professor Kumar, has identified a drug that's, I believe, used for rheumatoid arthritis that may have promise. It's had in laboratory. So to condense that back is the research story is going to be even more compelling in this campaign than it would have been before, because we're going to be able to highlight how our faculty researchers were on the front lines for this pandemic, and that be able to tell the story that, that's one example. It's not the only story about how the research that we do is relevant and impactful. So I think it will put a greater emphasis and a finer point on that part of the case. Secondarily, our School of Public Health is less than a decade old. It has definitely stepped to the fore. We've got a couple of our professors that have been in the media just about every single day. Professor Chow has been in the national media and in the international media for his disease modeling work. And then Professor Harry Hyman, very prominent in Georgia for his work on what it's going to take to get back to normal. So again, it's going to allow us to elevate some of our newer research and academic offerings in that way. So I think that helps. The other piece is, as you know, Martin, part of the success in our first campaign was our student success work.
Right.
I think what comes out of this is we're, as you mentioned, we're rated, we've been continuous or repeatedly cited as #2 in the country for innovation. And a lot of it's in that space. But what we're seeing through this virus and this pivot and the sheltering in place is that our culture of innovation, our culture of database decision-making, right, and our embrace of technology to be able to serve people at a very high level is going to be an innovation story that's going to be even more compelling than just the student success story. So I think we're going to have just a case that is even more exciting than in the campaign we concluded just a couple years ago.
Yeah, and I have to believe that for the research university, COVID-19 is going to elevate their posture, their value proposition, the society's faith and confidence in them, and delight that they're amongst us and they're as strong as they are.
Yeah, it'd be very accurate to say that I think here in Georgia that our elected officials, are now much more aware of the capacity, the capabilities, and the contributions that we bring to an issue as as dire and as important as COVID-19.
So in our remaining few minutes, give me your sense of what higher education is going to look like, how it might be different 3-5 years from now. Certainly there's some gloom and doom out there. I'm looking at an article published a few days ago stating that COVID-19 is the tsunami higher education has been fearing. 3 types of institution are particularly vulnerable, but it's not just them, it's the great disruptor, that being COVID-19, and it is much more than that. A number of institutions, another prognostication, as many as 1,000 institutions might not survive COVID-19. What's your thinking about how this is going to change and change permanently higher education?
So first off, I absolutely believe that those institutions that were already economically or financially fragile are going to be hard pressed to survive. In 5 years anyway, 2025, 2026, we're going to see a demographic shift where the number of 17, 18-year-olds graduating high school is going to plummet, and it's not coming back anytime soon. So those institutions were already challenged, and so the good news is they were already trying to figure out how to deal with economic stress. But this is probably the tipping point for many institutions. And as you say, there's going to be different types of institutions be affected differently. But private institutions without strong endowments or very strong markets, if you will, for their tuition-driven programs, as well as public institutions without strong markets for tuition-driven programs, and are heavily reliant on state support, are all going to be in extremely difficult situations. But I think there will be a good number of strong institutions that are strong financially, have strong balance sheets, as we do as Georgia State, have no burdened themselves with debt, and have the nimbleness and the ability to adapt. So I think let me go from saying it is doom and gloom for some institutions, but for many of us, it's looking to the future and saying, okay, so we're on a sailing ship, we're tossed about in the storm. It feels like we're getting hit by waves from every direction. The skies are swirling, but the skies will eventually clear and the waves will settle down. And our responsibilities as presidents and as leaders is that our ships will be pointed in the right direction and have the wind in our sails when the day clears. So we are going to be making changes. So as I look at going to the future, it's going to be, we get on the other side of this. We will be much more capable at engaging learners in ways than we were able to do before. So let's just take, as in the little bit of time we have, and just talk about online learning. So people think of online learning as a sort of way to get a degree in that modality when they don't have another choice. And there's certainly a lot of for-profit providers have filled that niche over the years. But as I look at, as we build our online capacity, and we were working in this direction anyway, knowing what's coming in 2025, 2026, but it's been accelerated by the pandemic, is to look at how do we use online education to better serve the students who are full-time or residential on our campus, as well as serve new markets, because there are going to be new markets. So when I look at what we need to do for the 53,000 students we have already, there's a number of challenges and problems we have institutionally that can be addressed by being able to offer important parts of the curriculum online, in addition to or in place of 300-seat or 200-seat auditoriums. So that piece is, I think, going to be more important. And I think it's going to be particularly important because we're now going to have a generation of students, those coming out of school who've basically been forced into this world, and the students who are with us, who are going to realize that they can survive in the online world. And what I'm predicting, and this is sort of a crystal ball, but that we will have a student population, perhaps as early as this fall, and certainly within the next year or two, who, even if they are on our campuses and living in our residence halls, may want to take as much as 40 to 60% of their courses online, take the rest in person, and then give themselves the flexibility in scheduling to be able to get involved, whether it's with campus activities. This would be, obviously this would work well for student athletes, but it's also going to work for students involved in other organizations, and very importantly for students that are going to want to have a strong experiential component to their education. And by that, I mean internships, whether it's going to be here in Atlanta at the state capitol, whether it's going to be with the more than 19 Fortune 500 companies, or the plethora of startup companies. So I think the future of education looks like a blend in a traditional institution of online and face-to-face, so that the students' four-year bachelor's education, so to speak, will be much richer and will have much stronger experiential components facilitated by our ability to deliver high-quality education that doesn't require you to be in a certain seat and in a certain room at a certain time on a certain day.
Do you foresee any tuition differentials in that model?
Not at this point, because I actually had to answer this question for TV News a couple days ago, and they said, are you going to lower tuition? So let's start with that online tuition at Georgia State's the same as in-state tuition, and the reality is that the number one cost driver of any institution are the salaries of the people delivering that education, and those salaries are the same whether you're teaching online or face-to-face. And so our number one cost driver is people. And in an online world, the demands actually go up, not down. You may have fewer classroom maintenance demands, but then you've got all the technology support and maintenance and the licenses and the contracts. So online is not cheaper. There's that perception, but if you actually look at what people pay for online degrees, particularly at the for-profit providers, it's typically quite a bit higher than what they would pay at an in-state institute, their state institutions for that degree.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the end of our half an hour, and there's a lot more we could cover. And I want to thank you, Mark. I know how challenging these times are for CEOs of large institutions and organizations. Perhaps we could prevail upon you in a month or two, check it back in with you and see how things are going at that point. Let me remind our audience that today's webinar will be posted on our corporate webpage by next week, and we'll continue with this series with additional speakers. But thanks again, Mark, for joining us today, and good luck with your continued success.
Thank you, Martin. Be safe and be well, and look forward to that day when we'll be able to meet in person once again.
As do I, after a haircut.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody out there.